Welcome everyone for the wireless security session. My name is Asif. I'll be your host for next 60 minutes. If you have any question while I'm presenting, please write it on the chat window or raise your hands. We'll respond to you. Today, we'll be going through the following topics. First, let's start with what's authentication and encryption. Next, we'll be looking into evolution of wireless security, followed by encryption and authentication standards like WEP, WPA, WPA2, and WPA3. Then we will look into the types of heap, general heap call flow, when to use heap PSK or 802.1x. Then we look into the secure way to connect public wireless. That's a hottest topic which is getting discussed. And then we'll move to the additional layer securities like management frame protection, VLANs, MAC authentication, access control list, rogue IP detection. Finally, we'll be touching upon the best practices for wireless security. Let's start with what is basic authentication. Dictionary definition, act of showing something is real, true or genuine. But when we talk about wireless networks or wired network, authentication is a method to validate whether it's a legitimate user or a malicious user trying to get connected to the network. This can be validated using username password or using certificates or a token. For doing this validation, it needs to have an authentication server to decide whether it's a legitimate user trying to access the network. Let's see what is basic encryption. I know this is basic topics, but let's go through it. Encryption is the process of scrambling the plain text data to an encrypted text, which can be read only by a legitimate user. If a malicious user will not be able to access or read the actual content of data, even though he get the scrambled data. Encrypted text, also known as ciphertext. Ciphers are a method of replacing the original letters with another letter, number, or symbols. In wireless data encryption, there are two types of cipher algorithms are used. One is RC4, reverse cipher, which is a stream cipher. AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, which is a block cipher. When we say it's a stream cipher, each bit will be encrypted at a time. But in case of block cipher, the block of data will be encrypted at a time. Usually the stream ciphers are faster than the block ciphers. Let's see the evolution of wireless security. On an Ethernet network, connectivity was more important than layer 2 security. One of the reasons for that was malicious user want to access the network, then he need to get into the physical access to the network. With the development of 802.11 standard, layer 2 security became essential. The main reason for that was the actual 802.11 packet is transmitted over the air. A malicious user can, sitting on a car parking area, can sniff the wireless packet and can read what is getting transmitted between the host. So as part of 802.11 standard, layer 2 security standards also evolved. Wired equivalent privacy was the first encryption standard evolved along with 802.11 standard in 1997. This was mainly to provide data confidentiality so that a malicious user will not be able to decrypt the packet without the actual encryption key. There are two implementations of WEP. One was WEP 64 and another is WEP 128. It uses RC4 algorithm to encrypt the wireless data packet. But WEP encryption method was weak, so it was cracked within a couple of years after the release. So Wi-Fi Alliance announced WPA or Wi-Fi Protected Access in 2003 as a replacement of WEP. WEP was a gap filling before the actual 802. WPA2 standard release. WPA was TKIP. WPA uses TKIP for encryption and decryption of wireless data, which is actually designed by 802.11i task group. TKIP also uses RC4 to encrypt the wireless data, but it is better than WEP. That's one of the reasons Wi-Fi Alliance recommended to use WPA in spite of WEP. In 2004, WPA2 was announced by Wi-Fi Alliance, which mandates all the elements of 802.11i protocol. WPA2 is considered to be more robust and secure than WPA or WEP. The encryption method used for WPA2 is CCMP, which is based on AES. WPA2 still considered as secure, but recommended to use complex passphrases and better if you use WPA2 Enterprise than WPA PSK. In 2018, Wi-Fi Alliance announced a new evolving standard as WPA3. I mentioned this an evolving standard. The more details I'll be talking in the following slide. Let's look into more details about each encryption methods. WEP has two implementations. One is WEP 64 and WEP 128. The number 64 and 128 is the combination of shared secret plus the initialization vector. In both cases, the implementation of initialization vector is 24 bits and the remaining is the shared key. So if we take WEP 64, 40 bits is the shared key, which can be configured as a 10 hexadecimal character or a 5 ASCII character. And the remaining is 24-bit initialization vector makes WEP 64. Unfortunately, still some of the old 802.11a B clients in the network only have the capability of WEP. But we highly not recommend to use WEP as an encryption method due to its weakness. WEP can be configured via a service CLI in CNPilot, and you can configure the same through a CNMaestro using user-defined overrides. Next, let's look into the Wi-Fi protected access, which uses WPA-TKIP. WPA-TKIP was an interim solution to replace WEP, but TKIP uses the same underlying mechanism like WEP. TKIP uses the shared key plus the initialization vector passed through a key mixing function before passing into the RC4. This key mixing function was not available as part of WEP standard. Basically, TKIP is stronger than WEP due to the key mixing function, which eliminates the key recovery attacks, but still is prone to other vulnerabilities. So we don't recommend using WPA-TKIP as an encryption method. By default, in CNPilot and CNMaestro, WPA-TKIP is disabled. But if some customers wanted to enable it, we have a CLI for doing the same. Let's look into WPA2 or Wireless Protected Access 2. WPA2 uses AES as the encryption method for robust security. In WPA2, there are two modes of protected access. First one is WPA2 personal or WPA2 PSK, which is commonly used in small wireless networks. User needs to key in the passphrase, which is used as the pairwise master key generation. This is very easy for deployments. WPA2 personal uses per session 128-bit AES key for encrypting and decrypting wireless data. Second is WPA2 Enterprise, which is otherwise called as WPA2-802.1x, which needs an authentication server for authenticating the user. At the end of the authentication process or the radius handshake, AP receives a session master key, which is used to generate the per session encryption key. In both WPA2 personal and WPA enterprise, the encryption decryption key is generated using an ePOL four-way handshake that we will be looking in detail on the next couple of slides. As a result of the four-way handshake, two keys will be generated, one for unicast data and another for the broadcast and multicast data. There are so many flavors of EAP available, but here we will be covering most commonly used methods. EAP TLS, Transport Layer Security, is the most secured method for authentication, as server verifies the client as well as the client verifies the server in this method. Server requests the client identity by checking the client certificate and make sure that the server is talking to the right client or right user. The same way, client requests the server certificate and make sure that the client is talking to the right server before exchanging any key materials. EAP TTLS or tunnel TLS, this method server identity will be validated by client requesting the server certificate, but the client identity will be verified or validated using another method like PAP or CHAP or MSTAP v2. Next is EAP, protected EAP, which is very similar to EAP TLS, except the client authentication uses another method such as EAP MSTAP v2 or GTC. Next is EAP SIM or AKA, subscriber identity module. This is the most common method in cellular network, which uses SIM card as the identity and verified using the authentication server. This is heavily used in Passpoint or Hotspot 2.0 networks. Let's look into a general EAP call flow. Consider a wireless station wanted to connect to a WPA2 enterprise WLAN. As usual, wireless client will be start sending a probe request and access point will be sending the probe response, then followed by an null auth request and null auth response. That is common for all the wireless connection. So I explicitly didn't mention here. So let's start with association request from the wireless client and association response sent by the access point to the wireless client. Followed by a ePOL start will be sent by the wireless station to the access point. This is not a mandatory packet as per the standard. Some client implementations send ePOL start. Irrespective of ePOL start, access point will be sending an EAP identity request to the client's wireless station. So if it's a WPA2 enterprise, EAP identity request and IP identity response you will be see in the wireless. So once the wireless client send the IP identity response, access point will convert that to a radius access request and send it to the radius server. Radius server will send a radius access challenge back to the access point, and access point will send as an EP request to the wireless station. Depends on the flavor of EP using, there will be multiple radius exchanges and radius challenge packets we can see on the wired side, and we will be seeing a lot of EP packets on the wireless side. And finally, radius server will send a radius accept packet if it is a legitimate user. At this point, access point will get the session master key, which is used for actual generation of encryption key. Then we will be followed with a four-way handshake process. In this case, actual unicast and broadcast or multicast packets will be, the keys will be generated for unicast, broadcast or multicast packets. Let's see more about ePOL four-way handshake process. Four-way handshake is used to generate PTK, which is pairwise transition key, and GTK, which is group transition key. PTK is used for encrypting the wireless data packet. If I say correctly, the part of the PTK is used for actually encrypting the wireless unicast data packets. And GTK is used for encrypting and decrypting broadcast and multicast packet. As part of the first four-way ePOL handshake, access point sends the message 1 to the wireless station, which will have a anons. Anons is nothing but a random number. Once the message 1 received by the wireless station will generate a PTK. PTK, as I already explained, that is used for encrypting the unicast wireless data packet. PTK is generated from PMK, which is pairwise master key, plus A nonce, which is the random number, S nonce plus AP MAC and station MAC via a random function. Once the wireless station generate the PTK, wireless station will be sending the message 2 to the access point, which contains the S nonce plus the MIC. S nonce is a station nonce, again a random number, and MIC is generated as part of a key from the PTK. Once the access point receives the second message 2, access point has all the information to generate PTK. And at this time, access point can really validate whether the station is using the same passphrase or PMK. Once the validation is done, access point will generate the GTK and send it to the wireless station. GTK is encrypted using a portion of PTK. Wireless station installs the GTK for encrypting and decrypting the broadcast and multicast packets. Then it will send the ACK packet as the completion of four-way handshake. With this four-way handshake completion, access point as well as the client will have two keys for encrypting and decrypting unicast packet as well as encrypting and decrypting multicast and broadcast packets. Let's see when to use WPA2 personal or when to use WPA2 enterprise. WPA2 enterprise is always a preferred method because it provides stronger security than a passphrase. Easy to revoke a certificate issued to a user if the user leaves the organization. And it's easy to apply per user policies. WPA2 personal might be needed because it's easy to manage and set up. No need of having an external authentication server to authenticate a user. But if you wanted to have a strong encryption method, then you can use WPA2 PSK. And WPA2 PSK is widely supported by most of the wireless client softwares and easier on IT side as it does not require a certificate or token to generate. Configuration, using WPA to PSK recommended using strong complex passphrase. Next is, let's see WPA2 configuration on CN Maestro. CN Maestro has the configuration for WPA2 PSK under the security options. You have two drop-down options. One is WPA2 PSK and another one is WPA2 Enterprise. If you are using WPA2 PSK, you need to enter the passphrase, and WPA2 Enterprise, if you are using, you need to configure the AAA server for the external authentication server. Next, let's talk about WPA3. Wi-Fi Alliance announced an improvement over WPA2 called WPA3. WPA3 is still available in two modes. It's like WPA2 Personal or WPA2 Enterprise. Here we have WPA3 Personal and WPA3 Enterprise. WPA3 Personal, which uses password-based authentication and derive a secure key between wireless client and access point. This provides strong protection for user against password guessing attempts by third parties. As I mentioned earlier, the second mode of is WPA3 Enterprise, which offers 192-bit encryption when compared with 128-bit encryption in WPA2 standard. But researchers observed some design flaws in WPA3 in April 2019, that's this month. Vendors are updating implementation accordingly. Next, let's see secure way to connect public wireless. Passpoint or Hotspot 2.0 is an improved method for connecting Wi-Fi hotspot, which is seamless and very secure connection between wireless client and AP, which uses eSIM or AKA as an authentication method. So this is very robust and secured connection between wireless access point and the client. In CN Maestro, you can find the configuration under the WLAN context. You can navigate to Passpoint. You will see all the configuration parameters needs to be configured for Passpoint or Hotspot 2.0. Till now, we have seen the authentication or encryption to make wireless secure, but let's talk about management frame protection. Protected management frame or PMF is an 802.11 standard defined for protecting the management frame from attackers. Now the management frame are in clear text, and if an attacker can sniff the management frame and spoof a DAuth attack to a legitimate wireless client, this can be protected by enabling 802.11w or protected management frame, which encrypts some management frames like deauthentication frame, disassociation frame, and some action frames after successful authentication. Next, talk about VLAN for wired traffic. VLANs are another common method to provide wired side security. For example, in a corporate network, the guest WLAN can be mapped to a DMZ VLAN so that the guest traffic can be policed on the DMZ side and separate from the corporate network resources. There are two ways to assign VLANs on CN Pilot and CN Maestro configuration. One is static VLAN and another one is dynamic VLAN. In case of static VLAN, WLANs are statically configured to a particular VLAN. So when a user connects to that WLAN, all the users will put it to that VLAN. In case of the previous example, the guest traffic can be mapped to a particular VLAN and you can do the policing on that VLAN. In case of dynamic VLAN, per user can be assigned to different VLAN based on the user policy or roles. So here you have the flexibility of putting different users to different VLAN. As part of the additional layer security, let's talk about MAC authentication. MAC authentication can be considered as a second layer of security in addition to WPA2. Or this can be considered as a device level security as well. But the flaw is MAC address can be spoofed. So only MAC authentication is not recommended to use in the wireless LAN context. You can use as a combination of WPA2 plus MACauth. But in some deployments, headless devices need to be authenticated using MAC authentication. Reason for that is some of the headless device may not have a way to configure WPA or WPA2 PSK. In such cases, make sure your devices are put to a DMZ VLAN and police that VLAN as per your network requirements. Let's talk about access layer control or ACLs. ACL is an additional layer of security you can configure as part of the WLAN. It can be configured on layer 2 or layer 3 or layer 4 access control, which can be applied to a WLAN. This configuration can be navigated from CN Maestro, WLAN context, go to the CN configuration, and in access control list, you have an option to add an ACL, which has the rules to permit or deny layer 2, layer 3, or layer 4 access. Next, let's talk about rogue AP and wireless intrusion detection. As the name defines here, rogue APs are rogue in the network, which is not a legitimate access point. Rogue APs may be connected by a malicious user to extend your wired network to wirelessly so that he can sit remotely and get connected to the wireless. Through wireless, he can reach to your wired network. Or a person in your organization itself would have connected another access point to the wired network for his convenience. The problem for that is it bypasses all your authentication controls and encryption standards. So we recommend the solution to enable rogue AP detection on your wireless infrastructure. And we highly recommend to enable wireless intrusion detection, which will look for malicious user carrying out attacks and report the same. Finally, we'll be touching on the best practices for security. Avoid open wireless networks. Always use strong authentication and encryption mechanisms like WPA2 PSK or WPA2 Enterprise. Use certificate-based authentication or very strong password enforced to the users. Enable PMF for protecting the wireless network from the attacks like deauthentication attacks. Keep all the devices like access points, devices, servers patched up with the latest software released from the vendors. Use strong passwords for access points and controllers. Thank you for joining the wireless security session. If you have any questions, please type on the chat window. We will respond to you. Okay, so if there is no questions, I'll stop this recording. Thank you again for joining the session.